Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Brigadier General Steve Cheney, the president of the American Security Project, and welcome everyone to today's event, Maintaining a Strategic U.S. Presence in the Persian Gulf. We're going to hold on here for just a couple of minutes to see if we can get some of our other people online here. So if you could just bear with us for a second, I would appreciate it. Thank you. And I think I see Dr. Al-Khater is on board. Is that correct, Doctor?
Yes, indeed, I am. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for coming today. I think we've got three of us. Colonel Roche is not on yet, but he is the latter of us to speak. So I think I'd like to go ahead and kick it off, if that's okay with you, Doctor.
That's fine.
And General Christman. Again, welcome everyone to the American Security Project event, Maintaining a Strategic U.S. Presence in the Persian Gulf. Again, I'm Brigadier General Steve Cheney, U.S. Marine, retired. I've been with ASP since 2006, along with General Christman, I would add. I was the CEO from 2011, 2019, moved over to be president in 2019. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we discuss a number of topics. Our research examines nuclear nonproliferation, counterterrorism, energy security, climate security, and much, much more. And of course, today's topic, maintaining a strategic presence in the Persian Gulf, is particularly relevant. Last week, we did release a paper titled The Case for U.S. Strategic Engagement in the Persian Gulf. It's linked on our website. It's also linked on the chat room here today. I strongly encourage you to read it. So I'd like to get right into the meat of things and talk a little bit about the U.S. presence in the Persian Gulf. As everybody's aware, in April, President Biden announced the withdrawal of all American troops from Afghanistan by September 11th. And I just read today that that is very much ahead of schedule and looks like they all might be out by July. So I think some automatically looked at that and said, my God, the U.S. is withdrawing from everywhere. And despite calls for total withdrawal of U.S. military forces from the Middle East by some, it is, we believe at ASP, it's in the U.S. military forces' best interest to maintain a military presence in the Gulf, even if it might be a lighter one, and certainly embedded in the security structure of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Now, everyone knows that the U.S. has key security and geopolitical interests that make access to the region critical for national security, and a total withdrawal of U.S. military forces from the GCC members would bode poorly for long-term stability and security in the region. You're probably aware that currently in Vienna, Germany, France, Britain, Russia, China are all facilitating the fifth round of talks with Iran aimed at bringing Iran and the United States back into the 2015 Jcpoa nuclear deal. Now, everybody understands that the U.S. has a lot more security interests in the Gulf than just Iran. I might add that the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign against Iran in Iraq further strained U.S.-led counter-ISIL campaign. And the U.S. will need to continue working with its allies in the Gulf to preserve its hard-won gains against ISIL and prevent any possible resurgence of Daesh in Iraq and Syria. With interest in preventing Salafist jihadist groups from using Yemen as a base for terrorist operations across the world that target U.S. citizens and interests, the U.S. will need to continue engaging the UAE and other Gulf states, in particular, and Qatar as well, on counterterrorism efforts in Yemen. In 2021, the Middle East is really going to have massive shifts as unresolved conflicts, and we're all familiar with them, continue to fuel regional instability. The U.S. should continue to engage the GCC states, which remain critical allies in meeting the shifting security challenges in the Middle East. We are delighted today to have three very distinguished panelists with us who are experts on climate and energy issues and security issues in the Persian Gulf. In particular, our first one up will be Dr. Khalid Al-Khater. He's the Director of Planning and Policy Department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Qatar. In early 2017, Dr. Al-Khater was tasked to establish the Policy and Planning Department after returning as ambassador to the Kingdom of the Netherlands from 2014 to 2016 and permanent representative to the OPCW. Dr. Al-Khater led climate change diplomacy as the head of COP18 and the president negotiation team from 2012 to 2013 that resulted in the Doha Climate Gateway Agreements. From 2006 to 2011, Dr. Al-Khater was posted as the GCC Secretariat to the GCC Secretariat in Riyadh. There he was tasked to establish and direct the Strategic Dialogues Department and to initiate systemic and comprehensive engagements between the members of the GCC and key countries and IGOs. Our second person up will be Lieutenant General Daniel Christman, United States Army retired. General, welcome. He's former Senior Vice President for International Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. From 1996 to 2001, General Christman was the superintendent of the United States Military Academy at West Point. And also during his tenure with the U.S. Army, he was the assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and represented the United States as a member of NATO's military committee in Brussels, Belgium. And last but not least will be Colonel Dave DeRoches. He's an associate professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Security Studies. Prior to this, he was the director responsible for defense policy concerning Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, the UAE, and Yemen. He has previously served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as the DoD liaison to the Department of Homeland Security, and as the Senior Country Director for Pakistan, and as the NATO Operations Director as the Deputy Director for Peacekeeping. Well, that all said and done, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Al-Khater, and I'll turn the floor over to you, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Warm greetings to everyone. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and also want to thank ASP for organizing today's event. The launch of your very important report on the U.S. security presence in the Gulf is commendable for its timing and content. Indeed, the issue of American strategic presence in the Gulf and elsewhere in the Middle East is a topic that provokes multitude of views. Due to the constraints on time, I will limit myself to 3 points. My first point is about the engagement-disengagement debate. I think we can agree that there is a shared perception in the Gulf region remains at the heart of the Middle East. Gulf countries are not only key in energy sector, but play a significant role in shaping investment decisions across the globe, as well as its contribution to sustaining regional security. Over the last decade, Gulf countries have also increasingly impacted the dynamic of wider Middle East. Sometimes this has been in terms of humanitarian and development assistance, but other times due to security factors. However, malign actions have weakened regional unity, leading to security crises and conflicts. To most experts, the logic of national security means that while the US-Gulf relations may ebb and flow, America will never entirely disengage from the region. Indeed, at this time, we know that President Biden's administration has in fact prioritized Gulf security and engagement. This includes Iran return to compliance and US recommitment with the 2015 nuclear deal. Since the dangerous escalation of tensions last year between Iran and the US in the Gulf, Qatar has successfully stepped into providing its mediation expertise to contribute to achieve calm and de-escalation. Without much vital global strategic assets, especially maritime, would have been dangerously affected. And because the Jcpoa also needs scaffolding, Qatar is supportive of efforts to initiate regionally led confidence-building measures to restore dialogue and rebuild trust between Iran and the Arab Gulf states. Then there are parallel Gulf issues, including GCC unity, Yemen, and Iraq. While if we broaden out, it includes Syria, Libya, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let us take, for example, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a timely reminder of the important impact that a country like Qatar has made in mediating and providing unparalleled humanitarian and development assistance to achieve stabilization and security. The recent Israeli attacks on Gaza has brought to the world's attention the ugly fact that for more than 14 years, Israel has imposed a land, air, and maritime siege on Gaza's 2 million inhabitants. The crisis has also highlighted the problems with Israel's policies in East Jerusalem, not just in terms of limiting religious rights of worship for Palestinian Christians and Muslims, but through its illegal practice of settlement and eviction, which many consider tantamount to ethnic cleansing. Qatar calls through its mediation efforts for a negotiated and sustainable solution to the conflict that recognizes the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people in accordance with the relevant UN resolutions. This reaffirms our role in supporting peace on the basis of justice. This brings me to my second point, which is that through the US deepening its strategic partnership with Qatar, common regional goals can be realized on the basis of more balanced approaches that are more cooperative and sustainable. This is because Qatar understands that the key purpose of security cooperation, diplomacy, and mediation, which are a firm foundation for countries to work from. It is important to highlight that the security relationship between Qatar and the US is one of the strongest in the region that contributes most effectively to global defense objectives, such as defeating Daesh. Qatar's support for the US defense and security at the Al-Udeid base means that it serves as a center of optimization for the improvement of integrated defense initiatives within the region. Our substantial input for the co-located resources and expertise of US CENTCOM and US Combined Air Operations Center thus makes a major contribution to future-proofing US air defense. This is defense in the Gulf, which enhances security and stability in the region, as well as being part of US Indo-Pacific power projection strategy. My third point is that the US security presence cannot be separated from sound and strong US policies in the region. In this context, Qatar can be very helpful. Its overall foreign policy approach is forward-looking and based on understanding that the region cannot move forward without adopting an approach that is based on the broader consideration of a shared and responsible future. Such an approach needs to incorporate and balance key interests of the region. Such an approach is not exclusive to national interests between states, but it also advocates the requirements of responsible governance to achieve stability of states. Furthermore, it incorporates global cooperation through the UN and other global and regional organizations that provides and nurtures a positive environment for the people of the region. Such a multi-pronged and balanced approach is much needed as we move into a new phase of regional relations, and that calls for a path towards a shared and responsible future. Finally, we can evidence the very positive and enduring momentum between Doha and Washington that has aided the review and enhancement of broader strategic defense, security, and economic priorities in the Gulf and the wider Middle East. Indeed, the launch of the Qatar-US Strategic Dialogue in January 2018 and subsequent dialogues has provided an important mechanism for this momentum. This demonstrates that Qatar, despite being one of the smallest countries in the Gulf, carries its responsibility for sustaining constructive security dynamics and burden sharing in its own region. It can be counted on as being part of the solution to emerging challenges. Thank you.
Dr. Al-Khater, those are wonderful comments. Very much appreciated, and we'll have a little short discussion here following the other two participants. I might add here that to everybody, we are taping this. It's being recorded. It will be put up on our website, so everything's on the record. It'll be on the website in the next couple of days. With that, I'll turn it over to General Christman.
Thanks very much, General Cheney and Dr. Al-Khater. Appreciate your comments very much. Let me start by saying that the ASP paper that General Cheney described is an important paper about an important region. And I really encourage the participants here to pick it up and read it. You know, it's very easy to look elsewhere to other spots on the globe as our national security strategy has evolved towards great power competition and the Asia Pacific. But this region remains critical. And the arguments one hears about looking elsewhere sort of go like, why keep anything in this region? Even a lighter footprint, why do that? Well, what I'll do is just quote one sentence from the paper, which I think summarizes it beautifully. The report says, and I quote, "The US will always have an interest in the energy-rich and strategically vital Gulf," end of quote. And I just would add personally, that interest will endure even as we shift to carbon neutrality by mid-century, even as we increasingly focus on an increasingly aggressive China, the interest in this region will endure. The ASP paper uses the word vital to describe this particular region, and it's appropriate, but the vital term has sort of gone out of style of late in official US government policy statements. Recall, and I was in the Pentagon when this first happened, President Carter was the first post-war president to use that term in 1980. But the ASP paper uses it to describe this region, and it's very appropriate. The countries in the region are our friends and have been for decades, and they share a common strategic goal, and that's to maintain stability. As the paper states, and as the subsequent panelists will, I know, emphasize, stability here is closely connected to stability or instability in other parts of the globe. And it's in our interest to have a military presence here, as the paper says, even if a lighter one. And by the way, it's always nice when the interests of a country that requests bases or spaces or room for presence coincide with the interest of nations offering the bases and spaces, like Qatar, like Bahrain, like others in the region. So while many voices are arguing in the US for us to leave the Middle East, as we saw over the last 2 weeks, the Middle East is not leaving us. So what to watch for? Let me just wrap this, Steve, by saying, what's on the current policy radar screen that might tell us whether the important conclusions of this ASP paper, that we should maintain a presence here, will be followed, at least over the near term? And I'd argue there are probably at least 4 indicators to watch. And the most important one, in my view, is how does the Biden team balance its emerging national security strategy, which has a focus on Asia Pacific, with this region? Will the Persian Gulf be relegated to an economy of force theater, as some have written? Now, I think that's unlikely, and one of the reasons is highlighted in the report. Adversaries will step in if we leave, and I trust the White House understands that. But here's an example, not often highlighted. China has just signed a 25-year, $400 billion strategic investment program with Iran. It's a deft move by the PRC, by the way. And keep in mind, it's in China's interest to keep us engaged here. Their investment in Iran serves multiple Chinese strategic goals. A carrier battle group here is one less in the South or East China Sea. So first, be on the watch as President Biden publishes his new national security strategy later this year. Secretary Blinken, President Biden, they gave us a preview of how this will look. Dr. Al-Khater has touched a bit on this in his remarks. Both the president and the Secretary gave interim guidance, as they phrased it, in early March, and it was encouraging. Both Blinken and the president stressed, and I quote now, engagement and reconnecting with friends and allies, including old and new partners in Africa and the Middle East, unquote. That's good stuff. But again, watch for the rollout later this year. Second, and related, US forces in eastern Syria and Iraq. As the paper says, we can't let our attention on Iran divert our focus on the Islamic State. Daesh remains active in both of these states, and hence, as a second point on the radar screen to look for, watch for forthcoming decisions by the White House regarding US forces in those 2 countries. Do we pull out? Do we remain? Do we reconfigure? That call by the president, when it's made, will say a lot about how President Biden balances his views on the Asia region with how he views ISIS and the important interests we have in the Persian Gulf. So stand by. Third, Iran and the JCPOA. Simply put, the GCC countries must be part of the diplomatic engagement that tries to reinstate the nuclear deal. Candidly, all tea leaves are suggesting the JCPOA will be revived, likely after Iran's June elections and before year end. As the paper stresses, the US needs to ensure that GCC friends are consulted, are listened to. They may not all agree with a return to the JCPOA, but their voices must be heard in the councils that consider the final reinstatement deal. It's what friends do. Last, the global extremist threat with an important eye on Yemen. You mentioned this, Steve, Dr. Al-Khater has as well. The ASP paper stresses how critical it is that we understand Yemen, at least partly in these terms, for what that country means in countering a jihadist threat. The humanitarian concerns in Yemen are enormous, but groups like AQAP who are embedded there are bent on reaching us here. Our friends in the region, engaging with those friends, are indispensable in keeping AQAP and fellow jihadists at bay. And maintaining US counterterrorism assets and special operations forces somewhere in this region is absolutely vital. I have little fear the White House will pull the plug on those assets. If that happens, it's a bad sign. So Steve, I'll just close. The president has gathered veteran hands around him who I know understand that engagement with this region will be an enduring part of our strategy, again, as events of the last 2 weeks underscore. And the report just issued by ASP will help in ensuring that that always remains the case. Thanks.
Well, General Christman, great comments. I really appreciate it. And, you know, you're certainly correct that we've got a lot of old hands now that are working in the current administration to help this keep the boat going in the right direction. So well appreciated. I see that David DeRoches has joined us. Dave, welcome. You're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I apologize. I think I entered somehow as an observer instead of a participant, but maybe there's a cicada in the circuit someplace. Look, I am honored to be here. I'm impressed to be on the panel with Dr. Khalid, General Christman, and you, General Cheney. I have to start out by saying that my remarks do not reflect anything said, any position of the U.S. government. And I'm going to share with you some slides, if you don't mind, because I'm of that generation in the Pentagon where we can't go without slides. We can't speak without them. So I don't know if you can see my slides or not. It says that I'm screen sharing, but I see myself. Can you see myself?
I can see your slides.
Okay, so this is me, and once again, the U.S. government disclaimer. I'm going to talk two perspectives on Gulf security. One is the American perspective, and another is the Gulf perspective. And I'm going to speak broadly, so more than just Qatar. So what I say may not sync exactly with Dr. Khalid's remarks. But the first point, and this is one that I'm going to make all the time, is from the American perspective. People have this idea that with the pivot to Asia of 2010, really, in the Obama administration, that meant the rest of the world doesn't matter. That basically the Middle East was going to be abandoned, and the only thing that mattered was confronting China. This is an error. It was an error at the time. The pivot wasn't away from the Middle East. It was away from Europe. And if you look at the actual number of forces that were withdrawn, 2014 was the first year since 1944 that there was not a single US tank on German soil. We withdrew our heavy armor from Germany, but we still had 2 armored brigades, the equipment for them in the Gulf. And indeed, what's misunderstood was that the pivot was not towards the Pacific, it was towards the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And with an emphasis really on the Indian Ocean as a place where we could leverage our security concerns probably more effectively. Now, the problem is we don't have any bases in the Indian Ocean that are effective except for in the Gulf. So this point, and I've been making this for years sometimes to the same forum year after year, is that actually the Gulf increases in importance under the pivot. And, people like Prince Turki Al-Faisal of Saudi Arabia, who said, well, we used to have all these forces in the Gulf, they're not there. Those forces were never there to protect the Gulf. They were there to support the war effort in Iraq and in Afghanistan, which were decreasing. But the US security presence in the Gulf has actually remained constant. When you look at the Indian Ocean and how we're going to, project our interests in there, what you see is that we really only have a very small number of bases that are there. And we haven't added any since the announcement of the pivots. There's been no new harbors dredged in the Philippines, or pretty much the only increase over what was there pre-pivot was the establishment of a temporary rotation of Marines in Darwin, Australia. So 1,500 Marines playing volleyball in Darwin. That's it. There have been no new dry dock facilities. There's been no new airstrips made along there. So once again, this area is what's important to China. This is how they get their fuel. And the only way we can credibly project force into that region is not even from Djibouti, which is really a tenant facility. It's from the Gulf, with a limited presence at Diego Garcia, which is, the limits of expeditionary capability. Now, the United States is very, very, we have a blind spot towards Iran. I'm speaking openly and frankly, but the memories of the Iranian hostage, that is seen as such a horrible incident, so far outside the norms of international behavior, that the United States is unable to rationally deal with Iran, quite frankly. We view them as a level of evil that supersedes even Vietnam, where we lost 56,000 soldiers over decades. Right now, the new US Army uniform, the brown one, thank God I retired before I had to buy a new uniform. The shirts for that are made in Vietnam. We've reconciled to such a degree that the US Army uniform is made in Vietnam, but we have not been able to re-engage with Iran because, Vietnam fought us honorably in a war and Iran took hostages. Let's take a look now at the Gulf Cooperation Council. And again, I'm speaking broadly over a group of diverse countries, so there'll be some inaccuracies and simplifications here. The first thing is some of the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, view the Iranian state as part of a long-term revolutionary project to impose what they call the Shia Crescent. And this is a project whereby every Shia population in the Middle East, but particularly those that encircle the Arabian Peninsula, ultimately come under the control and direction of Iran. So they point to Lebanese Hezbollah, they point to various militias and the Bashar al-Assad government, which is not really, they're Shia the same way. They share as much with Shiism as Mormons do with Catholicism, but they're roughly viewed as aligned. And then, of course, the Shia of Yemen, who again are different from the Shia of Iran, but in terms of confronting Saudi Arabia, it's the same. So they see this as a decades-long plan to encircle and subject the Arab states of the Arabian Peninsula to Iran. And quite frankly, they think we're blind to it or we're complicit in it. So these are Arab editorial cartoons. They show the Iranian mullah who in the top upper hand cartoon, he's operating like an octopus and he has under his control Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq. And then the bottom one shows him at a photocopier, and basically he's putting on Hezbollah and reproducing the Houthis, who call themselves Ansar Allah, Brothers of Allah. Basically, that's a copy of that. They also see the prospect of a Jcpoa as basically a rather cold-hearted deal by the United States, whereas we get rid of Iran's nuclear program and walking off there within our bag. And in exchange for that, we cede Iranian control or Iranian primacy over the entire Middle East. Now, this is not shared by everybody, but there is a sense that we are playing fast and loose, have played fast and loose with Arab security interests for reasons that are either nefarious or just that we don't understand the nature of Iran or don't understand the nature of the threat. And that concern is widely shared. What are the implications of that? Well, the first thing is that Jcpoa didn't deal with Iran's ballistic missile threat. And this is really one of their key means to project power. We've already seen it now. Number 5 on this chart, the Qiyam missile, those are the missiles which are launched out of Yemen. They're painted blue and called Bakhar. But it's the same missile that's produced in Iran, cut in half, smuggled into Yemen, fired at Riyadh. And then the number 2, the Fatah 110, which is a reverse engineered Scud, marginally increased. And particularly number 4, the Zulfiqar, which is another iteration of the improvement with a solid fuel rocket, lighter fuselage, greater range, increased mobility. These are what they're firing to make accurate strikes throughout the region. Indeed, these are what they're firing at U.S. forces at Al Assad Air Base in Iraq. The increase in accuracy is of particular concern. This is the nose tip of a Zulfiqar missile showing it went from a baby bottle shaped thing to a cone shape, which indicates to missile engineers increased accuracy. And this is the product. This was a Daesh compound in Syria, which the Iranians said they targeted with missiles fired from Iran. probably actually fired from Iranian-controlled Iraq. But regardless of whether it went from 100 miles or 500 miles, you can see the accuracy where in the upper picture, there's a compound, and in the bottom picture, they managed to strike the one structure without damaging the other ones. This is militarily significant. It's more significant than range. It's more significant than payload weight, because this kind of accuracy really compounds defense planning and security planning for all of our partners in the Gulf and beyond. They also have a wide range of drones. This is a picture of, from Yemeni sources, Houthi sources of drones there, but most of these are Iranian designs or indeed Iranian produced. And the UN report of special experts on Yemen documented how components that had been shipped to Iran wound up recovered on the battlefield in Yemen. And of course, these drones were used to great effect in the attack at the Abqaiq refinery in 2019. This is an aerial photograph of the Abqaiq refinery. The blocks on the left, the cracking train, those were attacked by cruise missiles, reverse engineered Sumar cruise missiles, which are a reverse engineered version of the Russian KH-55 cruise. The spheroids were attacked with Delta Wing drones, which were of Iranian design. And while the damage was significant, the disruption was not because of the resilience and training of the Saudi Aramco workforce, which quite frankly was impressive and was unexpectedly good. This was the most recent complex attack on Dhahran. The red peninsula at top, which you see a picture of, that's the storage facility at Ras Tanura. This was targeted with ballistic missiles, we believe. And then at the bottom, the red missile there is the Aramco residential compound, which is kind of surreal. It's like 1960s California in the middle of Saudi Arabia. The green area around it is the air base, which used to be the international airport. The new international airport's to the north. And the blue area is the location of the Patriot battery. The white area is where we think the wreckage was brought down over the missile strike. It was a successful intercept by Patriot. And it's worth noting here that Saudi Patriot has performed, the Saudis are now the global leader in ballistic missile intercepts. They have more Patriot intercepts of ballistic missiles than the US Army does. Another Saudi thing that drives people crazy is disrupting commercial shipment. So this is from 2019, limpet mines placed on commercial tankers. There were about 3 ships that were disabled that way. Unclear whether they just wanted to damage the ships to send a message, or they wanted to damage the ships and then respond to the distress call, take them into custody, and then hold them for ransom, as they did with the South Korean tanker, in order to free frozen assets in South Korea. This was another ship being taken under IRGC control. This is the South Korean tanker, and it was held for ransom. Then, of course, you have the proliferation of proxy forces, the most prominent of which is Lebanese Hezbollah in the upper left hand, but also of concern are the various Iraqi militias, which are paid by the Iraqi state as the Popular Mobilization Forces, but many of them respond to Iranian orders. And indeed, there was recently a missile fired from Iraq into Riyadh in response to a car bombing, Daesh car bombing in Baghdad, with one of these militias basically putting out the word that if there's an attack in Iraq, we will counterport in Riyadh, mimicking the Iranian messaging that Daesh is a creation of the Gulf Arab states to destabilize the destiny of the Shia revolution under the Iranian leadership of the Velia Faqih. So the new administration, as General Christman noted, they are experienced, they've done things, they know their way around town, and they've worked on these issues. But this is also of great concern in the Gulf, not officially, where officially everybody's always happy with what the United States does, but unofficially, you know, the problem is many of these leaders were greatly involved in the Jcpoa negotiations. Wendy Sherman, who is the Deputy Secretary of State, was the lead negotiator. Rob Malley, the special envoy, greatly involved in this. And a difference between the American and the Arab mindset is, I can't tell you at how many conferences people have come up to me and said, Rob Malley, you know, his father founded the Egyptian Communist Party. How can he be in the US government? You know, this idea that we don't visit the sins of the father on this, and that is unthinkable in other cultures, in some other cultures. So they give concern because the fear is that they are not negotiating with an eye towards advancing security interests of the world, particularly the region and the United States, but rather with an eye towards pride, towards recovering what their hard-earned gains, which they may feel was squandered by a capricious Trump administration. So I'm sorry to speak so briefly, but there are differences in perspective. The report lays out what's important there, but the key point I want to make is the United States is not withdrawing from the Gulf. We will remain engaged in there, even if we want to. I want to close with a paraphrase of Joseph Stalin. The United States may not be interested in the Gulf, but the Gulf is interested in the United States. And with that, I welcome your most difficult and challenging questions, and thank you for your patience.
Dave, those are wonderful comments and deeply appreciated. Dr. Al-Khater, I know your time is limited. First, let me say up front, we talk about ASP often as a small organization that punches well above its weight. Well, Qatar obviously does that. I mean, for a small country, you are contributing immensely to peace and stability in the Middle East. And I think many, to include myself, are unaware of your involvement with Gaza and Israel and the resolution of that situation. I think mostly what you're hearing about today is Egypt. There are others involved here, certainly Qatar. And I can tell you from my perspective, we are deeply appreciative of that. And along that line, I know that Qatar now has positioned itself as kind of the mediator of the Middle East. I mean, you are the ones who are on all sides. I mean, you've worked hard on the Afghanistan issue as well, certainly with Iraq. How do you see yourselves going in the future in regards to each one of those conflicts?
Well, thank you. I think going over each one of the conflicts is a big ask of a discussion, trying to forecast some of these things. But I think going back to my opening remarks, I think we have a long forward-looking vision for the region. We believe that this region can not only survive, but also thrive if people believe that there is a shared vision that can be achieved, that responsibility is shared, and that such a responsibility needs to take account of different and diverse interests of the region, and therefore needs negotiation and needs discussion, needs dialogue. It also needs to account to much of the ambition of the youth in the region in creating their future. And it also takes account of how we should work at the global level through the UN and relevant UN agencies and institutions to really create the proper environment. I think going forward, going back to my remarks, going forward in this region, I think we're going into a new phase of relationships, much changes and dynamics, which coincide also with the Biden administration's taking office. And therefore, I think there's a great opportunity that through dialogue and understanding with the countries and the powers who are effective in the region, that a different pathway can emerge, which does not repeat some of the problems and faults of the past. And I think this is a key important issue to be examining and to be thinking about as we go forward.
To General Christman and Colonel DeRosa, you're certainly welcome to step in anything you might want to add here. I think we'll have a short conversation here among ourselves in maybe 5 or 6 minutes, so we'll open it up. I'll go ahead to you, Dave.
Well, I just want to say that Qatar's commitment to peacekeeping goes well beyond the Middle East and extends far back in time. So those of us who worked in Bosnia at the turn of the century, Qatar was a major donor to that. And I spent a lot of time working on a Bosnian forces military training complex that was funded by Qatar. And then, of course, in the 2000s, we really appreciated Qatar's efforts. They negotiated a ceasefire and the peace treaty between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And then finally, I should note, I was actually in the Four Seasons in Doha and came that close to Omar al-Bashir when Qatar negotiated the independence of South Sudan from Sudan. And that was a 30-year long-running scab on the world. South Sudan hasn't worked out that well, but they were key players in that. So the Qatari commitment to international peace building in beyond just the Gulf is kind of an open secret among US government and UN security professionals, and it's laudable.
Oh, no doubt, it's definitely laudable. Like I say, a lot of it seems to be, and I won't say under the covers, but it doesn't quite get the notoriety that it should. General Christman, any thoughts?
No, in addition to the remarks by Dr. Al-Khater and Dave, Qatar has also been a convening authority for international business. One of the reasons why the Doha airport was so hugely expanded was to provide this hub for annual regional investment conferences that share ideas on where investments in the region and globally can best be directed. I was at one of those in Doha about 10 years ago. Extremely valuable, again, as a convening venue for business leaders, investment leaders, and thought leaders around the globe. So I just add that on the private sector side, in addition to the public national security dimension.
No, the great comments. Dr. Al-Khater, I'll ask you one more question here, and to kind of fuel us between the four of us here. We all familiar with the, I would call them internecine arguments among the GCC countries, not the least of which was the blockade of Qatar by UAE and Saudi Arabia, but that's now behind us. And has that dramatically impacted your ability to work through the GCC and work through these peacekeeping efforts?
Actually, I think part of our insistence was during the blockade is that the GCC was the right structure actually to be working through, and it was one of the ways that we tried to resolve the blockade, and also to engage on some of the security proposals which were proposed during President Trump's administration and carried forward by the US. So actually the GCC, although at certain levels had issues, but in terms of security and in terms of cooperation at the security level, that was kept intact. And therefore, it allowed an opportunity really to resume and strengthen going forward such cooperation.
No, that's a great comment. I think you really came through that in a positive fashion, and it's commendable for sure. Any other thoughts from Dan or Dave? Dave?
Yeah, well, the GCC blockade was really interesting for me, just as a sort of issue of national identity formation. A lot of the GCC states are somewhat challenged to define a distinct identity. They can say we have a lot of stuff. What do we have here? But it was apparent to me about 2 weeks after the blockade, you know, when you drive around Doha and you saw these huge banners of Tamim Masjid. Scholars say that the Soviet Union didn't form a national identity really until the Battle of Stalingrad. And I think the blockade kind of was the Stalingrad for Qatar, where now it has a much more, I sense a much greater sense of unity, natural purpose, and identity coming out of that. I'm sure that's an unintended consequence by the other states that imposed the blockade. But it has allowed Qatar, at least socially, to emerge as a stronger entity.
You know, those are great comments. Dr. Al-Khater, your comments today were phenomenal. We really we appreciate what Qatar's doing. I think it's really contributed to stability there. So I want to thank you for being with us today and taking time, and appreciate you being on the panel.
Thank you, John Roche. Thank you, Lieutenant General Christman. Thank you, John Cheney, and all the viewers and participants. Goodbye.
Goodbye. For the other two, stay on. Dave and Dan, be with us. I'm starting now to field some questions from the audience. I might add to the audience, there's a chat room. You can put up questions and they'll get forwarded to me, and I'll ask them where I can. One of the questions is asked is that President Biden says he wants to end the U.S. support in terms, I'm sure, of arms to the war in Yemen. And I'm sure this is on the Saudi Arabia perspective, but Dave, your thoughts on that, in particular in regards to stability in the Persian Gulf?
Well, so there's political criteria and there's military criteria, and you guys are more successful in your military career than me. So, but I'll just say that this idea of offensive versus defensive weapons, that's a concept unknown to military science and military practitioners. That's a political distinction. So, I've been getting calls from researchers for members of Congress to say, well, is this an offensive capability? Asking about things like maintenance on Saudi aircraft. And the short answer is there's no such thing as an offensive or a defensive weapon. It's all in how you use it. I mean, the closest thing to a pure defensive weapon system would be an air defense missile, but the Syrian missile, which recently landed close to the Israeli reactor site in Dimona, that was actually an air defense missile that missed its target and just kept on going. So, and that created about as close to existential angst as Israel has experienced in the last 3 years. So the distinction is a political one, phrased in military terms, but I mean, I don't think it's relevant to military people.
No, great point. Any thoughts on that, General Christman?
I'm not sure what a cessation of weapons shipments to a country, in the case of Yemen, that has civil wars within civil wars within civil wars. It is an impossible conflict to try to describe simply. And I think the point that Dave was alluding to is to ensure that what we do is to protect the legitimate security interests of our friends, of the Saudis and the UAE, while trying to work with the UN to broker some resolution to Yemen, especially to help with the humanitarian challenge there, while at the same time, we not lose sight, that was the point I was trying to make and the point the paper made, not lose sight of the extremist concern with AQAP and their fellow jihadists, so that as we worry about Yemen and other dimensions, that we not lose sight of that. I think that's the really important immediate national security, short-term national security issue for us in Yemen, while we work the diplomatic, humanitarian, multinational approach to resolve the internal conflict that's fueling the desire to aid and equip military forces.
Yeah, I think too many people look at Yemen with blinders on and just think, we have nothing to do with this. Let's just get the hell out and leave it alone and let them fight it out. And as you've just pointed out, it's a lot more intricate than many would believe. I meant to add, after your last comment about Doha and the airport, that your comment came from the former vice president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and somebody who obviously knew with great interest the business interest that's going on in Doha and that whole realm. So I wanted to point that out too. We had a question about climate change as it relates to our forces in the Middle East, in particular, Al Udeid Air Force Base, which has seen an increase in temperature upwards of 2 degrees centigrade in the last 40 years plus. And for those of us who've been there, or if you stood on the tarmac, I mean, the comment I had from an F-16 pilot was, you can get in your revetted F-16, which is in the shade and fire it up. But once you put it out on the tarmac, where the temperature can go to 140, 150 in a nanosecond, you hardly have any time to get it off the ground. So the question is, how much is climate change going to impact our ability to keep our forces there? And are we taking that into consideration? And I think, Dave, you might perhaps have more of a grasp on this perhaps than the other two of us.
Yeah, well, the actual worst for it is not so much Al Udeid, which has, as you said, fighters, but at El Dhafra in the UAE, where their tankers, they're too big to put in shade. Mm-hmm. And so guys, maintainers on that, they've spoke of feeling the soles of their boots go gummy under the heat while they're working on I mean, it's, you have to keep moving or else your boots might melt to the tarmac. That's one issue, the operational problems. But, if we're operating in the region, presumably everybody has it. The bigger issue, Qatar is a rich country. If it costs more to desalinate water, they'll pay more to desalinate water. The bigger issue is the climate change as a driver of regional instability. I'm like half a military guy, half an academic guy. In the academic world, there's a lot of analysis coming out that basically ties the Arab Spring into climate change, and particularly the Syrian revolution into a long-term drought that led to failure of agricultural crops that led to political instability because there was so much corruption that the state couldn't efficiently distribute food. And it's worth noting, the observation, there has yet to be a famine in a politically responsive, well-run country. So I think the greater issue is not so much the inconvenience to U.S. forces. We'll find a way to engineer our way out of that. It's rather increasing stability. And, let's face it, we're dealing with fragile governments in most of the region here. So the possibility of state failure, which requires an accelerated or rather an enhanced U.S. capability, that's the greater concern for me.
Yeah, I'm often asked, can you give me an example of climate change creating conflict? And my, we say it's an accelerant to instability, and your example of Syria is the prime example. 2006, 2011, the worst drought in their history. And the point to that is it drove all the farmers, first off, they lost their crops, lost their ability to sustain, and headed to the cities, not the least of which was Aleppo, which became a little prominent earlier on. But that what people don't put the two together is that instability fed ISIS big time. And it also fed Assad. So Assad started barrel bombing the people. And on the other side, ISIS started offering, hey, we'll give you food, we'll protect you, we'll give you money, but you got to join our cause. And boy, that really added to the instability of the Middle East, certainly all the ISIS fights that we saw. So it's a great point that you brought up. I might add here, talk a little bit about Iran and the Jcpoa. And we at ASP have long been proponents of the Jcpoa. And I say we're nonpartisan. Clearly when you look at our founders, we had 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. Of course, when one of our founders became the Secretary of State, John Kerry, and one of his pride and joys of being there was the Jcpoa. And of course, that got thrown out of the window when the Trump administration comes in. And my point to this is the Middle East can look at us and go, okay, under Obama, we got into the Jcpoa and everybody was relatively pleased. Not everybody, but some. And then all of a sudden Trump comes in and gets thrown out the window. And now we're going to go back in. But 4 years later, what's going to happen there? So Dave or General Christman, do you think they look at us in the Middle East and go, it's like a ping pong ball? Yes for 4 years, no for 4 years. Where's the stability here coming from the United States?
Yeah, I just start, Dave, that does raise the issue about the predictability of our own national security decision-making process. If you're sitting in Tehran, just stepping back, just as you point out, if Biden is successful, and again, I think the tea leaves are saying that he'll be successful between now and the end of the year in reinstating the Jcpoa as we've known it. What is there in Tehran to predict that if Biden leaves in 3 years, that the next president won't do the same thing? And it's a hugely important dimension of our national security and foreign policy. And so obviously what the president wants to do here, what President Biden wants to do is, A, reinstate it, get both the US and Iran back into compliance, but B, to try to address what all of us recognize who had, some timid but still support nevertheless for the original Jcpoa, to rectify the shortcomings, especially the sunset provisions and some of the inspection provisions that allowed Iran to shield some of the more important sites. And that's the hope here over the near term. And in terms of the actual deal that might be negotiated in Vienna. But the bigger issue, Steve, and I'm so glad you raised it, was exactly how you phrased it. How will the US consistency in how we deal with major national security issues affect the Iranian view on whether to come back in or not, regardless of the blandishments that we offer to get them to return?
Yeah, it's a tough one. And Dave, I know you've been there frequently, and I'm sure you hear it from both sides.
Yeah. Well, so the problem with the Jcpoa, with analyzing it, and by the way, I should note, since I'm going to be talking about former administrations, you mentioned General Christman had been the vice president of the Chamber of Commerce. You forgot to mention Mark Esper worked for him there. So worked for him. So
that's bipartisanship for you.
That's right. There's really 2 theologies at play here. One theology is this idea of max pressure, that if we just, clamp down hard enough, they're going to do what they want. The second one is this idea of the ink spot of virtue. If we get them into one good thing, they'll see the benefits of that and it'll spread out. And both of these haven't been tested long enough. If you ask ink spot of virtue people, why hasn't this worked? They'll say, well, it wasn't tried long enough. Trump threw it out the door before it could have taken effect. But that's not exactly true. I mean, we said that if we let China into the WTO, they would, and give them the Olympics, they would modify their human rights policy. All that's happened is they've become rich, technologically adept oppressors of human rights. Same thing with max pressure. It's like, okay, how hard do you want to squeeze these guys, before it becomes apparent that they're willing to, in the words of the Pakistanis, when we were imposing nuclear sanctions on them, they said, we will eat grass before we give up our nuclear program. So, it's kind of like talking to an undergraduate about socialism. They say, well, it just hasn't been done right. You say, well, what about Russia? It hasn't been done right. China, Cuba, Venezuela, it goes on and on and on. The main concern, I think, with the JCPOA as implemented, there were two problems. The first problem was the United States only really had one tool, that was sanctions. We waived all the sanctions for one element of Iranian behavior that we were concerned about. And that gave Iran a free hand to carry out genocide in Syria, and I'm using, ethnic cleansing, supplanting Sunni people with Shia people, in some instances imported from Iraq, to alter the demographic balance, which is definitely ethnic cleansing, possibly genocide, allowed missile proliferation, hostages still being held, impunity with not just shooting on demonstrators in Tehran in 2014, but shooting at demonstrators in Iraq today. So that was a criticism. The second problem with JCPOA, and this is why I'm not sure why Iran would do this, is it's not a treaty. And, Tom Cotton was criticized for writing the mullahs, giving them a civics lesson, saying, if it's not a treaty, we can change it. And it's not going to be a treaty. The Obama administration, it's phrased as Republicans versus Obama, but Chuck Schumer and Bob Menendez opposed JCPOA. Now, part of that's probably for conscience. Part of that's because Chuck Schumer is, he represents the people he represents in New York State. And, you don't have as much flexibility in dealing with Iran if you represent New York State. Part of it is Bob Menendez, was just bloody minded because he felt he was being harassed by the Department of Justice under the Obama administration. But, if you're the president, your job is to lead the people in your own party and to push through a treaty. The chances for a treaty now are less than they were before. So, I hope for the best. But it's hard to see how this rabbit can be thrown out of the hat. And if I were an Iranian, I don't know, the Iranians know our political system. They are very politically savvy, and the people we interact with in the foreign ministry are not necessarily calling the shots. So as Javed Zarif's tapes indicated. So I don't see why they would agree to something with the intent of being bound by it. When they know that there's a 2022 election coming up, and they know that it's unlikely that Biden himself will run for a second term in 2024, or at least it's questionable. So I'm just not sanguine. And meanwhile, the argument continues to be a theological one, where we just haven't done this theory or that theory hard enough. It's like medieval Protestants arguing with Catholics over the natures of the sacraments. There's a significant amount of faith here that is resistant to empirical evidence. I'm sorry to be so negative and so verbose.
Well, you're not making me overly optimistic here. We all know that Capitol Hill is treaty averse, not to bring up an old one, but the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, which we've been pushing for 40 or 50 years. We still can't get them to be a signatory to it. So I don't see any treaties coming up by either party anytime soon. And I now close with this last one from one of our constituents here, that is there any hope that the administration can at least cultivate the other side that oppose anything JCPOA, which you hear now all the time coming particularly from Republican side of the House, but is there a way to ameliorate this, to at least offer an olive branch to get them to come over to the side to help support it?
Well, Biden doesn't need, it's going to be an executive action, much the way President Obama made it. I totally agree with Dave. The idea about formalizing this in a treaty, it just blows the mind in terms of trying to think of the number of Republican senators, even Democrats, that would be necessary to secure the ratification of a treaty, like SALT, like START, like the the ABM treaty in 72. So that's just not going to happen. The best that can be hoped for is to secure the kind of guarantees and inspections of those guarantees by the Iranians that will lessen the nuclear threat in a region that remains volatile. The worst thing in my mind would be to have a dust up in the Gulf with the Iranians with the kind of North Korean nuclear capability that Tehran might have farther into the decade. And I think that's the best we can hope for, to keep the inspection regime in place to try to solve some of the short-term sunset provisions. As you know, we gave on the missile control from the interim agreement to the final, which provided the loophole that Iran needs to continue to test and hopefully to close that. But anything beyond that, particularly trying to constrain regional mischief for Iran, I think is wishful thinking.
Yeah, well said. I couldn't have said it any better. Well, we've certainly reached the bewitching hour here, and I want to thank both of you for just phenomenal comments. Dr. Al-Khater was great as well. We will continue on this particular issue. We're going to continue studying it for at least the next year plus. Remains a priority for the American Security Project. Dave, your comments are wonderful. Your presentation was great. General Christman, equally so. So I want to thank both of you. I want to thank for all the participants, the people who listened in. We had a great number, so I appreciate that as well. Stay up on our website. Again, we recorded this. It's all on the record. If you have any specific questions, go ahead and send them back to us through the website, and we'll answer those. So with that, I'm going to close it out. And I want to thank you both. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.